So what I'm going to talk about this morning is the customs implications of expanding into new markets and what companies really need to know in order to prepare, I suppose, for the UK being a third country market, and also similarly for expanding into new non-EU markets. What are the customs implications and what are the customs requirements? I think this morning has been extremely interesting in highlighting the awareness among Irish companies in terms of customs, trade, supply chain, and the amount of work that really needs to be done. If you look at the profile of Irish companies, particularly in the food and agri-industry, we're mostly used to selling goods in the EU or in the single market. So now looking forward in terms of selling goods outside the EU, which where the UK will be, is a whole new learning curve for companies. I know most clients that we're dealing with haven't had to deal with customs in about 20 years and are very happy for that. They're a little less happy having to actually go back to it going forward. So, you know, this is for anybody who was around 20 years ago, there's some awareness. But nobody else really is. And you're really looking at learning a whole new tax, a whole new procedure for moving your goods, a lot of work in relation to the information that needs to go back to revenue, a lot of compliance requirements. As I always say, it's been done before. We have a very global economy. We sell out of the EU into the US and Canada, as we saw from the earlier slides. We're expanding all the time in terms of our global sales. So companies do this every day. And I think that's one really critical takeaway. International companies and companies in Ireland who are selling globally are doing it without any problem. Once you become aware and familiar with the customs requirements, it's just another procedure. Irish companies are not, Irish companies selling into the EU single market are not familiar, but again, they were doing this in terms of trading with the EU 20 years ago when we didn't have a single market and it was just the norm and it was day-to-day practice. So while there is a learning curve and there is a lot of work to be done in terms of upskilling, it's not undoable. It's a matter of just tackling it in a step-by-step process. And that's certainly one of the things that's coming out of the presentations this morning and the Brexit Barometer, is that the focus is there and the understanding is there in government in terms of skills training and the need to train people up. And we saw the report in the last week from the government with regard to the skills that they're going to be focusing on going forward, which include customs and trade and logistics and freight forwarding. And that's been echoed by Board Bia in all the work that's been done over the last year in terms of upskilling people in supply chain and currency, in customs, and there's been a lot of good workshops taking place over the last 6 months where training went into training people on a one-to-one basis in terms of what customs is, how you handle it, what are the tariffs, how do you move goods from A to B, and hopefully I think everybody found that very useful. So I would encourage people to continue to sign up for those workshops because it is a great resource. So if we go into what is customs, and first of all, look at the current position. So as we know, the UK is leaving the customs union on 29th of March 2019. Transition agreement has been agreed in principle to 31st of December 2020. And without worrying people unduly, I think it's very important, and this has come out of some of the conversations we had over coffee, and it's also been stated by Minister Creed this morning. The transition agreement is not, it's not a fixed fact. So at the moment we're looking at the UK leaving the EU in March 2019. The transition agreement has been agreed in principle, subject to the other issues that are surrounding the withdrawal agreement also being agreed. So again, going back to I think the important point from the barometer, the people need to be aware of customs. The requirement to actually understand the customs legislation may come into effect for your sales to Europe next year, maybe 2021. Again, though, either way, it's a requirement if you want to expand into new markets. So as we divert our market from the UK to our global markets, it's a requirement to understand how your goods actually move, what happens at the other side when they arrive in a new country, what is the importer of record requirements, which I saw referenced in the barometer, what duty rates could apply when you export into a new market, what import declarations and export declarations do you need to lodge. So I would encourage people again to just start learning and upskilling sooner rather than later. In terms of a post, so in terms of the future, we don't absolutely know what a future trade agreement is actually going to look like. It could take it could be a WTO agreement. It's always been said that that's the worst possible agreement. It's not ideal, but we trade on WTO terms with the US every day, so it's not the end of the world. Or it could be a free trade agreement, whereby goods which are exported to the UK will have no customs duties as long as they qualify as originating in Europe, and similarly goods being imported from the UK will have likely no customs duties as long as they qualify as originating. And again, I just wanted to point out on the originating on the free trade agreement, sometimes there is a misunderstanding that a free trade agreement automatically means a 0% duty rate. It doesn't. What it means is, first of all, you have to agree what products are covered. Now, if you look at the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, which is the one that's been, which is probably the most likely one that would be agreed with the UK, 92% of products are 0% for duty purposes under the Canadian Trade Agreement, and that's going to 100% over the next couple of years. So the chances are that most goods will be covered by the Free Trade Agreement, but in order to comply and to get that 0% duty rate, you do need to be able to prove to the authorities that your goods do qualify as originating. In order to do that, you need to determine what the finished product classification is for your product, and then you need to check what the rule of origin is for that finished product. Now, for most rules of origin, you're talking about probably substantial manufacturing, what's called a change in tariff heading, or perhaps a 60% added value. But you need to dig into your supply chain to be sure that that you are actually going to meet that rule of origin. So again, over the next couple of months, it's important to understand how free trade agreements work and how rules of origin work. Determine what the finished product classification of your goods is, determine what the rule requirement is, and then make sure you meet it, because you may meet it, but you also may not. If you don't, then you can look at alternative sources of supply, maybe increasing your levels of production. So there are ways then to manage that. But again, as with all customs issues, or any issues really, the important point is to start with understanding what the rules are and then move on from there. The customs partnership, which has been raised also as a potential agreement, that's what that is really, it's like a customs union with the EU. So at present we have a customs union between Turkey and the EU. That means that goods which are in free circulation in Turkey can enter the EU with no customs duties and vice versa. But again, you do have a requirement, as with free trade agreements and as with WTO agreements, to lodge your export declarations, to lodge your import declarations, and to ensure that you understand the classification of your products, the origin of your products, how they're being transported, what procedures you're using to transport those goods, and what the value of those goods are. So regardless, and I think this is one point that certainly would have come out a lot over various training sessions we do with clients, when you're looking at the future of either your sales into the UK or your sales globally, you're looking at two real aspects. One is, what is the potential customs duty rate on accessing a new market? And that will depend on the type of agreement that comes into effect. And secondly, what are the compliance requirements? How do you lodge export declarations? How do you lodge import declarations? What supporting information needs to be given? And what do you need to do to ensure you meet the requirements of the various authorities? That does not change regardless of the agreement. I think that's a really important point for people to remember. You need to understand the customs rules, because regardless of the type of agreement, WTO, free trade agreement, or additional customs union, you still have a requirement to lodge those declarations. So in terms of issues facing business at the moment, so I'm not going to concentrate on the first couples, they would be more a broader range outside of the customs area. But in terms of customs, we're looking at strategic sourcing, border delays, cost of imports, And then customs capability and understanding. And so that's an issue that just keeps coming out again and again. In terms of border delays, that's particularly important for the food industry. And anybody who is trading in perishable goods knows that you can't afford to have any delays at customs. So in that context, again, it's very important that when you're lodging your declarations with customs, that the information is correct and that all the supporting documentation is there. Your goods, if we look at Irish trade, 92% of our global trade will go through customs without any stops. So we have a very open economy, as everybody knows. We export around the world. 92% will be cleared instantly, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. 5% will be pulled for documentary check, and 5% or so, the numbers aren't quite adding up, more or less, will go for a full physical check. You're going to fall into that documentary check pull if your documents are not correct or your information is not correct. So that you can actually handle, that you can make sure it doesn't happen by just making sure the information is correct. And when you're looking at critical timings going through a border, that's essential. If you're trying to get if you're driving to meet a ferry in Dublin and you miss the ferry because of an hour's delay at customs, which is avoidable, then that means that you've missed the time that you need to get to your goods into your customer. So understanding customs can avoid delays. The other important thing actually about the economy we have, when you look at, as I said, most of our goods go through customs very, very fast, cleared pretty instantly. Also, however, 90% of global trade from Ireland is conducted through the AEO network, or the Trusted Trader network. So when you put those two figures together, we have 90% of goods being cleared almost instantly, and we have 90% of trade being done by trusted traders. If we now look at the statistic for trading with the UK post-Brexit, obviously anyone who is trading with the UK won't have had a requirement for trusted trader status. It's simply not necessary. But the revenue would agree, and HMRC push it extensively, that if you want to trade going forward and you want to again take action to minimise the delays yourself, then you really do need to start looking at the Trusted Trader application or the AEO application. Because if we want to continue that 90% of trade going through customs with as little problems as possible, then we want to make sure that the trusted traders are increased and we have more trusted traders in the country. It takes, as Tara was saying, about 9 months to get through that process by the time you prepare and then put the application in and then go through the revenue. So again, in terms of starting the process, you really want to be starting it fairly soon. So I thought I'd just put up some of the typical questions that we often get asked in terms of day-to-day, what are companies actually asking about. And the first question there is, excuse my eyesight is appalling, so I've got to really look to this. What does leaving the EU mean in terms of trade? So as I said, when you're leaving, that is a very initial question which people don't necessarily understand in terms of what leaving the EU means. The EU is one country for customs purposes. So when you were talking about importing into the EU or exporting out of the EU, you were talking about importing and exporting out of one country as if it was just Ireland. It means that no matter what port that you import into, you pay the same customs duty rate. The regulations are exactly the same. The duty that's collected is remitted to Brussels. Any auditing that's done is done by Brussels. So it's not a national tax or a national requirement. It is purely controlled by the EU Commission. As a result of that, the EU negotiates trade agreements as a bloc. So when you leave the EU, that means that you are a non-EU country. You do then sell into the EU as a non-EU country, but you also get to negotiate your own trade agreements. And that, as we know, is one of the issues that's quite topical in the UK at the moment. The next question tends to be, what is a hard Brexit and what is a soft Brexit? Well, as I said there, a hard Brexit versus a soft Brexit, in my view, is really only tariffs. So in a hard Brexit, there is no trade agreement, WTO duty rates kick in, and duty gets payable at the appropriate tariff rate. And obviously for the food industry and for the beverage industry, that is unfortunately very high. A soft Brexit means there are no tariffs, but you still have your documentary requirements. So as I was saying earlier, tariffs are really the only differentiation factor here. Will there be duties? Will there not be duties? Put that to one side. Will there be import requirements and export requirements? Yes, it doesn't matter. If the UK stays within the EU, and that's the customs union and the single market, there won't be, but they've made it quite clear that they are leaving. Which then gets us into the question of regulatory alignment. How is that going to work? And that's a whole other area, which I'm not even going to talk about, but you can ask Murray here. But it's been quite clear that they're planning to leave both. So there will be import declarations, there will be export declarations. So very important for companies to understand how those operate. Then in terms of cost of tariffs, I'll put up a few duty rates in a minute, just to give an indication of what those are going to be. Then we have what will be the impact of a trade agreement. As I said earlier, again, it's a question that comes up. People sometimes say, well, if there's a trade agreement, then there's more than likely going to be, one would assume there will be agreement, so we don't need to worry. That's not quite the case, so that will only affect the duty rates, and you still need to determine whether you qualify as originating, so you need to understand the origin rules. Are customs declarations required? The answer again is yes. So the only thing, and I know I keep going back to it, but it's just very important, because when we do customs analysis or Brexit analysis for clients, what we're finding is that the duty rates are obviously very important, and they need to be taken into account in terms of your costing. And that's the first critical thing that you need to look at. But people often forget the cost of compliance, and the cost of compliance can be equal to the cost of the duty rates. Does a trade agreement mean a 0% rate? Hopefully. The latest trade agreements that have been concluded by the EU are very comprehensive and do cover all products. But if we look at something like the Norway agreement, which will also be referenced often, or the Switzerland agreement, they don't cover all products. What are the documentation compliance costs? Well, the figure that's a reasonable figure to use is probably €100 a movement. So when you look at exporting out of Dublin and say importing into Holyhead, you're going to pay a clearance agent €50 to lodge a declaration on export, and then you're going to pay £50 to lodge a declaration on import. So that's a very average estimate, but it's not unreasonable. So for one of the things that we always take a look at from a logistics point of view is how many containers are being picked up on a daily basis, how many shipments are going through the ports, and then multiply that by 100. And then we want to look at different options for seeing if we can reduce that. Certainly for anyone transiting through the UK to get to the EU market, there's a huge investment going into the ports at the moment, into new routes, into new ships. So again, it's important to start taking a look at what those options are to see, is it better to actually go round the UK to get to Europe, or should you still think about going through the UK? It's most likely that the UK will agree a transit agreement with the EU, which means that when goods transit through the UK to get to Europe, they're not going to be hit by duty. So it's kind of like you'll suspend effectively the movement, so they never really enter the UK market. That will also, of course, have documentary requirements, which again will have a documentary compliance cost. So in building your costings going forward, again, you want to look at these aspects. In terms of potential delays, some you're not going to be able to take, some delays you can do nothing about. There is a random audit check test by the EU, so a certain number of 3-4% of goods must be pulled for full container check. Another 3 or 4% must be pulled for documentary check. But you can, as I said, minimise, and you certainly don't want to be pulled for checks simply because your documentation is incorrect or the declaration information is incorrect. For agricultural products, there is a 100% check on goods coming into the country if you're going to the border inspection posts in terms of documentation. And there's unfortunately nothing really much that can be done about that. But the AO and the trusted trader status, which we were talking about earlier, one of the aims of that is to actually ensure that those goods do move faster through those ports, so that you have like a green route and a red route. You're going fast. You're going to the fast route if you're AEO. You're going to the definitely probably be pulled route if you're not. So just in terms of a hard and soft Brexit, to reiterate that point, I just put up a slide there which shows what the difference is between a hard, and this is just, this is not policy or formal policy, but in my view, what I see is the difference between a hard and a soft Brexit. It very much mirrors a slide that was put up by Michel Barnier, I think he stole it last week, which shows what customs controls are in a hard versus a soft Brexit, and the only difference was really the top two. So either way, you do have requirements for your VAT on import, for your customs controls, import documentations, non-tariff barriers, regulatory alignment, and transit requirements. In terms of non-tariff barriers or even kind of non-customs related issues, it's kind of to the side, but we're seeing a lot of volatility in global trade at the moment when you look at the impact of the Trump sanctions on imports from the EU and imports from China. So it's important, in the global trade context, you also need to keep an eye on what is happening with other countries. And if we look at the retaliation measures to those, we can see, so tomorrow, or it's just been announced today, that the EU is imposing between 10 and 25% additional duty rates on imports from the US with effect from tomorrow. That's going to hit bourbon, your American jeans, peanut butter, sweet corn. So a huge amount, that's a huge duty that's going to be imposed on US products coming into the country very, very quickly. And in global trade, these things can happen very fast. So in terms of preparation, what should companies do? I think the first thing that, the first place we always start is the duty rates. So the first thing that everybody needs to do is take a look at the products that you import or purchase from the UK and that you sell to the UK or sell globally. And you need to assign a tariff code to those. You can start by looking at your intrastat returns. It's always a good place to start in terms of trying to analyse what duty rates might apply and what the customs classifications are going to be. Classification of itself is a very complicated area. There is really, I suppose, two types of products, some which are clear and obvious and have a very specific tariff heading, which you just don't argue with. So a cardboard box is a cardboard box. But people in the food industry are not exporting straightforward, simple products anymore. They're highly technological, combination, dual function. So in order to determine the classification, you do have to spend a bit of time going through what the potential options are and understand what the different rules for each classification option is. Everything in trade starts with classification. So if I could emphasize anything, particularly over the next 6 months, that companies should do, it's to start working on your classifications. From that will determine your duty rates. It'll determine whether what the origin rules are. It'll determine whether there's additional non-tariff barriers. There are fines and penalties for simple incorrect information. So before doing anything, I'd say start with the classifications. Then secondly, work out once you've confirmed your classifications, what the duty rate would be in different scenarios. So what's going to be the tariff cost? Secondly, start looking at the movement of goods and how many import-export declarations you're likely to be making, and work out whether you can bring that knowledge in-house through, again, over the next 6 months to a year and a half, taking advantage of all the training that's out there, and particularly, obviously, the Board Bia training workshops on customs. The more of that you can take in-house, the more you can take responsibility for yourself, the less you're going to be paying other people to do for you. And thirdly, look at the import VAT. That's going to be a critical cash flow issue. At the moment, if we're selling into the UK, the VAT is counted for through your VAT returns if it's B2B. Going forward, however, when the UK leaves the EU, then you will be paying VAT at the point of import. So that will be a massive cash flow impact. Not to worry people too much, but in terms of duty rates, they are very high for imports into the EU. The EU operates, as we know, quite a protectionist market in terms of, The EU operates quite a protectionist market in terms of food, and also has a very high focus on food safety and security. So you know, in terms of it is, as I said, going back to my earlier slide, really important to work out classifications of what you purchase and what you sell, and then identify what the potential duty rate is going to be in order to work out the potential cost for those. As you can see, they range from 8% in chocolate to processed food, 12.8%. And probably more importantly than a lot of other, the rates themselves are quite high, but also the agricultural components that are added. In order to determine the agricultural component, you need to know the milk protein content, the sugar content, the fat content. So, you know, it does take work to actually get through all that, which is why I'd say start the classification side of it as a very first step. This is an import document or an export document for anybody who remembers it. It used to be produced in green, so it's still represented in green, but it's all electronic now. So 54 boxes here. It's called a SAD document. Everybody's, I think, relates to that. So it's not SAD for SAD, it's actually single administrative document, but anyway, it is SAD. So you've got 54 boxes there to fill in, and you need to know each one. It really, there's no way of avoiding understanding what each of those boxes are. Some of it's fairly straightforward. So consignor at the top, who's selling? Consignee, who am I selling to? Who's your agent? Who's acting as your agent? What's the? Then you get into the tariff classification, the origin, the value, and the more customs-related information, and you add in your freight details. Is it moving by ship? Is it moving by air? Is it road transport? So it looks daunting. But a lot of those boxes that are there are not going to change. So once again, when you're setting up your systems, a lot of the information you can put in as standing master data. Your consignor is always going to be yourself. You can put in your various consignees. You'll probably find that your tariff codes range from, you know, they're not going to be, you're not going to have 5,000 tariff codes at the end of the day. Even if you have 5,000 SKUs, you'll probably end up with about 100 actual tariff codes. So it's quite possible to put this in an IT format, that you're not changing every single box every single day. In terms of VAT rates, then you're looking at a variety of rates. These are obviously quite high. VAT is recoverable, but it is still a substantial cash flow. So when you're running a business and cash flow is obviously one of the most important things, you need to be aware that this is going to change. The rules regarding imports are that you pay your customs and your import VAT at the point of arrival in a country. That would happen then for every container that actually is shipped. You do get and can get an authorization to defer that payment, so you're paying it the month after in one lump sum. To avail of that, you do need to get a guarantee from your bank. It's that whole process of getting guaranteed and getting authorized can take an average of 3 months. So again, in terms of timing, it's very important to start these preparations early. So at a very basic level, what is the potential risk of an increase in cost? If you're looking at the left-hand side, you see if you buy goods at €1,000 with freight and insurance of 100, that's 1,100. Going forward, or for any global trade import, you're looking at cost of goods is going to stay the same. Your freight and insurance, that really depends on your, if it's by road transport, is the freight going to be the same depending on the number of drivers? What about additional delays? Diageo estimated in a study done for Bloomberg that for every half an hour delay on crossing, or moving their goods, that there would be an additional €100 in freight charges. Then you've got your customs duty charge, that's not recoverable. Your import VAT is cash flow, but as I said, it is cash flow. And then your clearance costs, which are the costs you pay to your agents, which are not recoverable. So you are looking at quite an additional increase in the cost of selling goods on a global basis, and you need to be able to make sure that you've prepared for those and looked at ways of reducing those costs, either by bringing the clearance in-house, or by looking at alternative routes, or by looking at the actual tariff classifications and spending some real time on them to see if there's opportunities for reducing those to a 0%, and in many cases that there will be. So for planning ahead, what would I say? Issues facing exporters are that you need to look at, first of all, your increased controls on exports and imports, your declarations, your risk of tariffs, your risk of non-tariff barriers, your VAT, and your guarantees. So that, I think if everyone took that slide away, even said, these are the critical issues that I need to be looking at going forward, and this is what I need to bring back to my business and say, am I comfortable with these? Do I know what these issues mean? If I don't, then I do need to learn about them. What we would recommend is, again, we get people sometimes say, well, there's no point us doing anything right now because we don't know what the future is going to look like. Going back to the points I've been making a couple of times here, we don't know what type of agreement the UK is going to have with the EU, and we don't know therefore the duty rates, but we do kind of know everything else. Once the UK definitively said they're not in the EU in terms of the customs union and the single market, then trading with the UK is the same as trading with the US. So what do I need to know? Or let's say it's the same as trading with Canada. If there's a Canadian, there is a Canadian free trade agreement, so therefore the duty rates are one thing, but the customs compliance costs don't change regardless. So steps I would recommend, first of all, review your supply chain. That's critical. Identify your key suppliers, confirm your customer contracts, and analyse your routes. When you're looking at your contracts, you're looking at what are the terms of contract. Am I delivering duty paid? As one of the earlier speakers said, does my customer in the UK just simply want my goods at 3 o'clock on a Monday at their warehouse? Not interested in how to get there, and it's certainly not going to help you act as importer. That's up to you, and most people would find that when they're dealing with customers. Secondly then, identify your risks. What are your WTO tariffs? What are your FTA, free trade agreement tariffs? Look at your licensing, your certs, your border inspection post requirements. Check your import VAT. Thirdly then, assess the impact on customs costs, border delays and origin costs, and build those into your criteria. And finally, and it's really for anybody trading with the UK, it's almost inevitable, you are going to need to look at the application for trusted trader status. So look at what's required there, really focus on upskilling and learning. Training is absolutely critical. And look at duty savings options. So if you're, for example, importing goods from the UK into Ireland, manufacturing and re-export, there are customs savings procedures, which means that you don't have to pay duty on arrival. You do and can get to suspend those. And then just to finish off on a very quick slide about trusted trader status, it does involve three aspects, which are customs, IT and security. You can apply for the customs one alone. That will give you access to customs simplifications. I recommend the full authorization because the security one is pretty essential for getting through the border quickly, wherever that is, ports or airports. So really, that you would ideally want the full thing. It does take time, however, and you need to build in that time. There are financial benefits insofar as your cost of guarantees to be lodged with the revenue for either your deferred payment authorizations or your warehousing authorizations are reduced significantly. You do get primary treatment at the border. You can go through customs much faster. You get the option to have your goods checked on site as opposed to when they're being cleared. So a huge amount of benefits. And as I said earlier, 90% of our trade currently goes through the Trusted Trader Network, and we see the results of that being very fast clearance times. So that's me.